Radio on litigation with the firm and kind of management, that sort of thing. I mean, we are a tech media IP firm, so a reasonable amount of what we do is technology disputes.
And I'm Simon. I'm one of the transactional partners here. I guess people are probably wondering why I'm standing in a technology dispute. I'd like to think it's not because I've created a lot of technology disputes, but one of the things that that we found really useful as part of the process for working on disputes is sometimes it's helpful to get that insight from the other perspective in terms of why do we think the contract says this, why do we think we've got to this kind of point. And so one of the things that I found really useful, and what I hope Tim has found useful as well, is being able to kind of come at it from that other perspective and say, look, I can tell you probably the reason this ended up here is because they started here and they started here, and this is where you probably ended up. So that's why I'm talking about tech disputes, not because I generate a lot of them, or at least not that I'm aware of.
I am looking forward to the day when I have to clean up when he misses. I don't think it's going to come, but that's fine. I mean, part of the reason Simon gets involved, we get Simon involved in tech disputes, other than he's awesome to work with, is that, you know, inevitably if these things get to court, you'll need expert evidence, and kind of I view Simon as an in-house legal expert, which is great. So he can kind of skill us up on that sort of stuff before we actually get cracking into an actual proper dispute. Look, so give you a bit of a sort of a guide as to what we're going to talk about today. I mean, we've just introduced ourselves. We're probably going to focus on primarily common causes of tech disputes, because we think that that's probably likely to be useful for people, because often it's not what you think. When something's going wrong, what do you do? What do I need to think about during that process? How do I move on? And then ultimately, we're going to wrap it up with kind of this winning, really winning. So
this seminar is probably a nice kind of bookend to the first seminar, which was about what are the key things to think about in terms of a tech contract in this day and age. And so, kind of very quickly recapping that. The things that we were talking about in terms of where we see things are now happening. The first is that we've kind of moved from a kind of a large scale implementation where you've got one system that rules them all to a bit more SaaS focused, a bit more cloud focused, and so rather than there being one large scale solution, there are a variety of layers of solutions that become part of the business. And so from that point of view, there is a level of kind of de-risking that happens because there isn't one single point of failure necessarily in relation to the way in which a business operates. That does, however, also result in perhaps a level of complexity that didn't necessarily happen before. When there's only one system to worry about, there's only one person to kind of focus on in terms of the relationship, whereas when you've got a multi-party kind of solution within your business for the way in which it operates, then there's lots of different parties to coordinate, lots of different kind of moving parts to kind of to focus on. The other aspect that we talked about in the first session is around the agile versus waterfall. Waterfall, a lot of work is done up front, a lot of kind of defining, and at that point there is this kind of very clear discussion around, right, it's going to be, this is the solution we want, this is the cost we're expecting, this is the timeline, this is your role, this is our role. A lot of work is done up front to be able to get to that level of definition, and then you get partway through the project and discover you actually need to change it. And so there's this whole kind of process around change management. Agile is probably like a lot of little waterfalls in itself, but there's not so much work necessarily done up front, and we're going to talk about it later. Maybe there should be a little bit more done up front in relation to it, but there's lots of little kind of steps that are taken as part of it. And so process becomes a lot more important in relation to this, making sure that you have the right process, the right people are brought along the journey, because you don't have that sign off at the beginning and then that sign off at the end. There is a lot of little processes that have to work through.
Exactly. So, those are, I mean, that's pretty key as well. And look, even though Agile is not a particularly new process, it's been around for quite a while, it's still a certain level of misunderstanding around what it means and what the impacts of it are for a tech project and the delivery of the outcomes from that tech project. To the point where kind of we heard a new term the other day, Simon, which was excellent. We heard a Wagile project, which you can probably hazard a guess of what it is, but it's not a thing.
I mean, from what we can understand, the way in which this was used, it was talked about in terms of it was a waterfall agile kind of hybrid, and now we've kind of drafted contracts that are kind of a hybrid between them, but there is no kind of right or wrong answer. It's just making sure that both parties understand what they think that they're doing as part of their process. And I think in that case, certainly our client kind of was surprised. They thought that they were doing an agile, and the other side thought they were doing some kind of waterfall agile hybrid, and that's where problems arose. I guess the lack of communication, the lack of clarity between parties, which is, I guess, what we're really talking about here. The common causes of tech disputes. I think ultimately the biggest cause is the one key cause is just communication's not kind of right.
Well, for some types, look, there are obviously kind of an innumerate number of different types of tech disputes. So if you're a software developer, then things that will be actually important to you might be intellectual property infringement, and that is an entirely different part of technology disputes. If you are effectively a reseller, then kind of supply chain management and contractual disputes around that will probably be pretty important to you as well. But what we're seeing a lot of, and what we're kind of the main things at the moment is effectively around kind of ICT implementations, which have gone a bit awry, and those often have a significant impact on the business rather than just necessarily one product.
Yeah, and so as I said, in relation to those, communication seems to be at the hub or at the centre of what the issues are. I mean, it's not the only thing, but then it kind of manifests itself in a lot of different ways. Obviously, there is a misunderstanding as a result of not being clear at the beginning as to what the expectations are. Communication doesn't happen well during the process. So you've got a poor process of kind of making sure that things that are learned kind of being escalated. And then the last one is oversold, and that's kind of more about somebody not necessarily understanding what it is that they're signing up to at the beginning and buying something more than what they were expecting, or with risks that they didn't understand.
So interestingly, most of the disputes we're seeing these days are not somebody actually stuffing up the kind of the technical side of the delivery. Sorry. It's around those key themes primarily. So the primary one is misunderstanding, and kind of we've got the first bullet point there, which is the customer's always right, which is kind of true. They have the objectives, they want the outcomes, which is fine. And I'm sure a supplier could bend and deliver those outcomes, provided they there's the ability to sort of change the project along the way.
Yeah, and look, I mean, I guess the customer is always right. I mean, in a lot of ways, but sometimes the customer will say that we want this, we want this, we want this, but they don't necessarily understand what they need. And the reality is that with any of these kind of things, and we said this in the first session that we presented on, any kind of technology contract is a partnership of a kind. The supplier is the subject matter expert in relation to the technology, but they don't necessarily understand the business and how the business operates and the way in which people interact with that business. The customer, on the other hand, is the expert in the business, but they don't necessarily know and understand how that technology will operate within their business. So the two of them need to actually share information. And so the customer may well come into something expecting an outcome because they've heard that this is what they need, and not fully understand why they're asking for it, but demand it anyhow. Now, if the supplier doesn't actually kind of work through and kind of make sure that they've tested that, they may well end up with an answer that is actually not what was needed by the customer, but what was wanted by the customer. So part of it is, even from the outset, it's not about being brave and saying the customer's not right. It's about making sure that the customer and the supplier are actually on the same page in relation to something, and having those conversations to make sure that we set the project up to succeed from the beginning.
Exactly. And no one wants to hear no, but a bit of a gentle sanity check on the way through is probably pretty advisable.
Yeah.
Another part of another one of the main roles or kind of reasons for kind of tech disputes is that the roles within the project aren't clear, and so that might be kind of the overall structuring. That might be the responsibility of the supplier. That might be the responsibility of the customer, and who's delivering what and how decisions are made.
Yeah, and look, whether you're talking waterfall or agile, there is not a project that that the customer can just sit back and say, well, it's all the supplier's responsibility from this point, no matter what happens. There are things, because this is going into the customer's business, so there are things that the customer will need to do as part of that. And so it's about making it clear who has what responsibility and what the risk is of assuming that responsibility. And it becomes that little bit more complex when you start to work in the agile kind of framework, because process is that much more important, and there can be a complete misunderstanding there as to who has what role. If you're not careful, the customer can misunderstand that actually the supplier is thinking that they're supplying experts with the systems, but they will be directed by the customer in terms of how to configure this relatively configurable piece of software to meet their requirements, whereas the customer is thinking, actually, this project is being led by the supplier. If the parties are not clear about who is ultimately responsible for delivering that solution, you've again got a project that's being set up to fail. So part of it is about making sure that you understand at the beginning who it is that has what role. And that's really important from a customer's perspective, because they are running their business. And so, they're busy enough as it is. If they are going to pick up the role of kind of driving this project to an outcome, they need to make sure that they've kind of freed up the resource to do that. And if they haven't, again, you have a project that's at risk of being not one that could succeed, because the time and attention hasn't been devoted to it.
Absolutely, and that's part of the thing, is that often it's around kind of managing internal expectations around the resources that will be needed, the responsibility of the customer internally. Because a lot of times the kind of less C-suite sort of project sponsors will go, okay, well, we've got you on board, do your job and deliver us what we need, but without actually kind of understanding that they really need to guide that process all the way through.
Yeah, I mean, look, and I think in the first session we talked about data being kind of a large risk with all of these things. And it's that adage that if it's garbage in, it's garbage out. So part of what you have to understand in relation to these things is who is kind of picking up different responsibilities, and data can be one of those things that can be incredibly expensive. You want the supplier to actually make sure the data that is being put into the system is accurate, complete, deduplicated, etc. But on the other hand, if that actually falls as a responsibility for the customer then needs to understand the level of work that they have to actually tidy up their data and have their data reliable, so that the system can deliver the outcome that they hope it to have.
Because you can guarantee that kind of if things start going off the rails a little bit, then kind of ultimately it'll come down to, well, I couldn't do my job because there were these dependencies that I needed to undertake, or that the customer needed to undertake, or the supplier needed to take me to do that. So those are that's a significant area of risk that we see. The other two, the next two in that sort of bullet point list, the scale of the job and on the time to evaluate, those two tend to go together.
They do,
and particularly in agile processes, the time that you have those is often lighter, because the idea is that it's flexible and you can work out what needs to happen on the way through. And customers, when they make a decision that they want to implement something, they just want stuff done. So the idea of kind of this sort of kind of time frame to evaluate means that process will be relatively short usually, and that means that often then kind of estimating the scale of the job, and that's both internally and externally in terms of expectations, won't always be as clear or as defined at the outset as it may need to be. Partly problematic is that you will also not necessarily have the time to test kind of assumptions that are made with that evaluation or with the processes that are there. And often when you get into a project, kind of the sort of the business requirements or customer requirements will change, and so that changes the scale of the job.
Yeah, and look, I mean, the reality is to get to that kind of level of certainty that you need, perhaps for a waterfall type contract. There's a lot of work that has to be done up front in terms of scoping and kind of getting into the business, understanding the business, so that you can actually get to a point of the supplier going, yes, I understand the scale of the work that I have to do, and therefore where the end point is. That doesn't necessarily happen in the same way with an agile contract. But at the same time, you need to kind of understand what is the expectations of the customer going into an agile contract in terms of certainty. It's very unlikely that your customer is going to be somebody that is saying, look, we just need the solution. We don't care what the cost is. We don't care how long it takes you to get there. They're going to have some expectations around that. And so there will be this kind of scoping at the beginning. And so there has to be this management of expectation as to the reliability of that information at the beginning that is being provided, and therefore the estimations that are being given at the beginning. because we've seen in a number of disputes recently that it was a quick and dirty scope at the beginning that the customer had kind of paid for, but that there were lots of kind of caveats around it that the customer hadn't necessarily understood. And so the challenge that you've got is that the two parties have gone into it with a very different expectation as to what the outcome is going to be. As the supplier has got to the point of understanding the scale of the job properly, they've seen that it's going to be much, much bigger, and at that point have been concerned about necessarily upsetting things with the customer, and then things start to go down a path that they could have avoided.
Absolutely.
So that's the challenge that you have, is that not enough time is invested at the beginning to make sure that everybody's on the same page in terms of level and scale and time and effort.
And so we'll touch on it later on, but one of the key things to think about, and this is at the outset when you're kind of setting up the project, but also on the way through, is making sure kind of decisions are documented, everything's documented. So if there are assumptions going in, they should be documented. If there are roles and responsibilities, kind of using the RACI model, kind of those should be very clearly recorded. If there are dependencies which are necessary, for you to continue to meet the project critical path, those should be recorded, and kind of all the way through that should be happening. Because otherwise things go off the rails. And again, we'll get to that in a minute. Now, the kind of the next parts around misunderstanding is both the scale of change and misunderstood, and the ease of accommodating that internally. And look, these are usually ones that fall on the customer side. And so inevitably, well, not inevitably, but often these sort of large-scale tech implementation will come as part of change management within a business. And so a big part of it will be kind of we're scoping this. This is how we want to operate. This is how we're planning to operate. And then so you start building a system or kind of a solution that deals with that objective in mind. And partway through, you find that actually there's a lot of organisational inertia, and you can't actually, the organisation can't deliver on that change. And so that will have a material impact on the work that's been done and the objectives of the actual solution itself.
Yeah, and look, we cover this again, and I think one of the things is while we've broken this out into three separate themes under the communication, these all kind of interrelate. One of the key things that can happen is that the people that are involved in the project from the customer side don't necessarily fully understand the way in which things happen within the business. They kind of may have a snapshot in relation to the business, but not necessarily everything. Say for a payroll system, they may kind of believe that there are so many kind of types of worker, and misunderstand that perhaps there's other levels of worker, other kind of arrangements that have been put in place, and don't necessarily capture everything that's needed as part of this process. So part of it is about actually understanding the scale of the change and understanding the way in which that change has to be accommodated. The reality with the new approach to the systems, which is that they're much more standard and need to be configured, is that you end up with a system that will only do certain things. At the edges, it'll be able to accommodate things because that's what it's been designed to do. But it's very much a square peg, and so everybody's got to kind of buy into the fact that there's got to be a square hole there for it to go into. If there's a round hole, then there are problems. And sometimes that customers are kind of understanding that they've got to create that square hole, but they misunderstand the level of work that's involved in getting that hole square.
So that's part. Yeah. So look, that's part of it. Is a big part of this around the communication is making sure the right people are in the right room. And so that's governance, and that's sort of delivery as well.
Yep.
So that's moving on to poor process. So we talk about governance and oversight. As I said, a big part is ensuring that there is are the appropriate voices at kind of various levels of the project structures, because that allows sort of fairly free flowing communication of issues that are necessarily cropping up, or and then changing sort of objectives and sort of outcomes that are required from the business perspective to flow back down fairly seamlessly.
Yeah, look, again, no matter how much scoping you get to do at the beginning, it comes back to the fact that this is a partnership between two parties. One is the subject matter expert on the technology, the other on the business. As they start to work on the project, they start to understand better the other side's perspective in terms of, so that's how your business runs, therefore we're going to need to do this within our system, and vice versa. And so that process will go on, whether it's a waterfall approach or an agile approach. What you have to do is make sure that the information is filtering up to the right level. The risk that you run is if it's all sitting down at the project manager level, that they may not necessarily have all aspects kind of signed off. They may be focused so much on delivering the right features, the right answers, that they kind of lose sight of other things that the business owner sees as critical to it. So it's about making sure that the project managers are talking and kind of realigning things as things are learned, but then also making sure that you have a really good process where that stuff gets escalated, because it may be that you are building the perfect answer. It may be that the users that are involved in kind of creating the stories and that then create the functionality and the features that you're looking for are getting everything that they want, but at the same time you're building the perfect answer, and it's an answer that is going to be too late and too expensive. So part of this is about just making sure that that the right information is being shared at the right level, the right decisions are being made, and everybody that is a stakeholder in this is actually taken on that journey to the end solution.
Absolutely. And another part is actually kind of a fundamental project structuring governance perspective. So where things can often fall down is that a customer will not just effectively contract with one prime and let them sort of sort out everything from there. We see a number of times where a customer will contract with one, possibly two, sort of kind of providers, then also contract with a kind of a software solutions provider directly. And what that can do is that means that it just adds extra layers of complexity and sort of governance issues around kind of who's ultimately responsible for delivery of the system. And if those two systems aren't compatible, what happens? If there are bugs in the underlying solution or kind of the environment that is being hosted in terms of a cloud-based solution is not correct, who is responsible for that? If you've got one prime, that is a very easy process to go, look, you're responsible for this, you sort it out. Otherwise, from a customer's perspective, if you have split this up to save cost or whatever reason, that will almost certainly lead to friction within the process and make it a lot harder to ensure that this runs smoothly.
Yeah, and again, that comes back to that feedback. If there are a number of different parties that are part of delivering this solution, making sure that if something is not quite working the way that it should, that the right parties are talking to each other about that, but then at the same time making sure that that is being escalated so that everybody that is part of this understands. Because two suppliers that are working as part of delivering a solution, if they can come up with a solution between themselves that has ignored exactly what the customer wants, you can still set this up with that, because you can build something that kind of produces information the customer doesn't necessarily want, or it doesn't produce the information in a timely fashion or whatever, but it's a solution that's been developed between two of the parties, but not all of the parties that need to have input into it. So it's about building that process right to make sure that everybody that needs to know knows, and the decisions are made. And then that kind of leads into the next one, which is the decision is made, now let's document it. And I know that sounds a little bit like me trying to create work for myself, but it's not really about that. It's about the process of actually recording the decision that has been made, and then recording that, making sure everybody agrees in relation to that, and now saying that decision has been made. Now, what's the flow and effect on everything else? Does that mean the supplier over here doesn't have to deliver this? Does this mean the supplier has to do things in a different way? And it's going back and then looking at that to make sure that there aren't any unintended consequences as a result of that. And that is not necessarily all about the lawyers getting involved. That's about the technology experts getting involved and saying this system touches on that system, but if this isn't ready by that time, then this has to happen over here. And making sure that all of those things are recorded and that everybody goes, right, yes, we agree, that's the new part.
Again, and decisions that are made, design decisions that are made, kind of assumptions that are made all the way through, dependencies, as Simon said, those are very key. And those documents, doing those things at the time is, from a litigator's perspective, an absolute boom. Contemporaneous documents help me no end. Whereas if there's basically, we had a number of discussions around those, this is what was agreed, but we've literally only got sort of very, very high level sort of minutes of a design meeting, which doesn't touch on those specific decisions or the rationale for them. That is very difficult later on, because if this does end up in court, chances are you will be arguing about that decision that was made probably 3 years prior, which is going to be going to be quite difficult for that. That said, the other thing to think about is not over-documenting things either. So what you can do, particularly in an agile process, is tend to kind of over-document. Basically, people will spend a significant chunk of their time actually covering their butts and kind of like, so much reporting that they actually do very little of the doing. And all that will do is that will lead to delays and kind of cost escalation as well.
Yeah. And actually I've seen it can also create that mistrust, covering themselves, just protecting themselves. And so it can have that kind of negative impact in terms of trying to get this project to the end point. But again, the last bullet point on core processes, we've already alluded to, which is you can have all of these conversations, but you've got to get the customer buy-in, and you've got to get the customer buy-in at the right point, and make sure that if you're changing the way in which something is done, that you understand the consequences of that and how that is going to impact on the square hole and the square peg.
Absolutely. And I mean, look, the project team itself, and that might be customer and sort of supplier side, can understand perfectly what is happening and understand exactly how this is going, but there might be an internal disconnect in terms of communication around what that actually looks like. And so it's sort of lost in communication. And then what you get is effectively C-suite going, well, this isn't what we're after at all. Even though the project team for both customer and everybody was delivering what they thought was necessary and what was needed, and that particular relationship was going very well.
Yeah.
So
then we get into the next one, which is the oversold. And I'd like to think that this doesn't happen too often, but I mean, I think we've all kind of seen circumstances in our own lives where we kind of want that best thing, we want that newest thing, we want that shiniest thing. And let's face it, salespeople are very good at selling things. So one of the things that you have to be kind of aware of is sometimes what are you buying, and do you know that you actually need it? And so it's not about kind of you shouldn't buy the latest and greatest thing, because it's the latest and greatest thing for a reason. It's been developed for certain outcomes. If you don't need those outcomes, then maybe you don't need to buy that latest and greatest thing. It's about making sure, again, that you understand what you're buying, and that it's that the reason that you're buying it is for the right reason, that you're not buying it just because you've been told it's the latest and therefore it must be the greatest. And it may well be the greatest, but it may not be the greatest for you. So it's about making sure you understand the decision-making and the purchasing process that you're going through.
Absolutely, and the rationale for it as well. Sometimes there are kind of people that will think, well, we've got a bit of a problem internally with our processes. We'll implement this tech fix, and that'll be kind of happy days. We'll sort it. It doesn't work like that. Kind of any business change will involve a lot of effort from an internal perspective, and so an assumption that a tech solution will solve all the problems is unlikely to be inferred.
Yeah, I mean, look, the reality is that technology is a tool; it's not the answer, and so you've got to make sure that you're able to use that tool in the right way. And so thinking that I've got a problem and I'll solve that problem by throwing tech at it doesn't mean that you're going to get the answer. You've still got to actually be able to use that tech in the right way. So that is going to require a lot of extra work from the business to accommodate it. And so sometimes, and I'd like to say I haven't seen it that often in recent times, but sometimes I have seen technology used as, we've got a problem, solve it by something. And in actual case, what they needed to do was take that step back and say, what's the problem? How do we solve this internally? And is there a tool we can use, rather than I've got a tool now, let's see if I can solve the problem with that tool.
Absolutely. And even though we haven't got it on the slides, one thing around being oversold is effectively just a bad deal. Frankly, it can often sort of impact delivery of a project and add a significant risk. And so kind of you may be a hard nose in the negotiation phase, put all the risk on a supplier or whatever it might be, and they may get to a stage where they're just sick of it and just walk away. And kind of from that perspective, if all the downside risk is on one party, that's not going to be a healthy situation for an ongoing relationship. So you need to think about that on the way in and on the way through, because like I say, people will just get sick of it and just walk away, and you may be left holding this half-developed product, which is kind of behind schedule, over cost, and then you've got to sit there and go, well, I'm not now prepared to try and pick this up and move on when kind of my suppliers just walked out the door.
Yeah.
So the next part we're looking at is something's gone wrong. What do we do now?
And look, again, in that first session that we talked about tech contracts, one of the things that I emphasised was that any tech contract is a partnership. You don't buy a solution to throw it out a year later. You are making an investment in relation to something for an ongoing relationship going forward. And so the challenge that you have is that as part of this, you're building this partnership, building this relationship, and the two parties will have sat down and said, what are the priorities? What is it that we need to deliver so that you, the customer, can get to the end point? And what do we need out of this to see that this is a success from our point of view? And then the customer is going to have gone through that same process. And when something goes wrong, you need to go back and look at those priorities and make sure that those priorities are still what you think they are, that they're valid, and what is the impact of what has gone wrong on those priorities. Because it may be that, that what's gone wrong doesn't impact on the priorities, it doesn't impact on what you want to achieve. But on the other hand, it may well do. But you now may need to reassess things because, as Tim said, you've got to get a solution in here. And so, you may need to say, well, actually, my priorities have changed. Priority number one is to get a minimum viable product in here and get it working, and then we'll worry about the rest later.
Absolutely. And one of the things to kind of understand on the way through this is that things will go wrong. There will be errors. There will be sort of kind of minor knockbacks. But the thing you've got to question is that likely to be material? Is that likely to have a material impact on the outcomes and sort of the or the critical path of the project? If not, then you work through it and away you go. If it does, then you start thinking about, okay, well, what are our priorities now? And then get advice. It sounds like we're trying to generate work for ourselves. We're not. That could be tech advice, it could be whatever it is, just around, you just need to understand the situation you are currently in. And that is, a good, robust, kind of understanding, kind of have we done everything we need to do? What's happened? What are the issues? What are the likely fixes? Kind of what are the outcomes of this? Have we done everything we need to? Have we given the kind of the resourcing we need, and go from there?
Yeah. Look, I mean, it is a partnership, and it's very unlikely that everything is going to fall at one party's feet in terms of what has arisen. And so, as part of this, you need to understand what your responsibilities are. What it is that you have done right, what it is that you've done wrong, and vice versa in relation to the counterparty, and then take that forward. But also knowing that you could insist on the perfect answer, but maybe the perfect answer is just not deliverable. And so, does that mean that we need to get to that point of, well, actually this solution is not going to work, or actually we've got no choice, this solution has to work. So therefore, what compromises do we have to make? So that when you start to have that conversation with your counterparty, you fully understand what you've done wrong and what you've done right, what you need as an outcome, what is possible as an outcome, so that you're talking and agreeing from the position of knowledge.
Exactly. And so you've got to understand, this is the thing, so you've got to understand where's your position of strength, where are your weaknesses, and so that way you can kind of, so think about, kind of how do we best get the right outcome for this. Now, one of the key things that we think is that kind of early and honest communication around this is really important. And so engaging early and not sticking in the sand is absolutely key. However, there is one caveat to that, and that is, kind of the number of times if you go through a discovery process and you see some sort of absolutely flippant conversation or email from a sort of a team member going, oh man, we really stuffed that up. Oh, this is really going to really impact the project delivery. You just sort of go, so just impress upon it on your team, just not to be flippant around that sort of stuff. That may not actually be the answer. And so just kind of think about it, take some time to consider, and then have a sort of an objective but honest conversation.
Yeah. It's about kind of making sure that you recognise the fact that that something has happened. The project is either going to succeed or fail as a result of this, and then take a real and honest view around what are the consequences of succeeding. What do we have to do to get to that point? And actually, again, that comes back to the fact that both parties need to come to the table and be a little open about some of those things. And maybe the first thing to do is to have that conversation in a way that you fully understand the scope and scale of it. If you go into it all guns blazing, I don't think you're necessarily going to get the open and honest conversation on the other side in relation to understanding the scope and scale of where you need to get to next and what effort is going to be required to get to that outcome. So, it's about making sure that you sit down, and as we said at the beginning, when you're trying to put this contract in place in the first place, you've got a subject matter expert in the business and a subject matter expert in the technology. there needs to be an exchange of information. And one of the things that you have to be careful here is, A, you don't compromise the case that you might have in relation to a dispute, but on the other hand, you don't kind of allow that you don't throw barriers up to actually getting a true understanding of what the answer is that needs to happen.
Absolutely. So early stages, I mean, like realistically, if things are starting to go off the rails, it's what you're trying to find is a constructive outcome that will deliver you the objectives you need. And getting very blamey very early is unlikely to be conducive to getting that result. And all that's going to do is that's going to escalate things. You're going to get somebody like me involved, which may or may not be the right answer in the end. But it's just gonna make life harder to find a kind of a low key acceptable solution that's going to deliver a result that both parties need.
Yeah. So I guess the thing is just to make sure, as part of kind of pursuing that answer, that kind of compromise, you don't actually compromise the remedies that you might have. So it's really kind of a bit of a needle thread there, but it's one of those challenges that you have is you need to get the communication working, but at the same time, you need to make sure that you're having that open and honest conversation and sharing that information. You don't actually create a bigger headache.
Absolutely. And so we mentioned it earlier, but documenting is absolutely key. Documenting what the issues are, documenting kind of how we got there, documenting the way forward, and also kind of if somebody makes an allegation on the other side or an assertion on the other side, don't let it slide. Don't get blamey, but you need to address it and just say, look, we at least say we disagree with that for these reasons, and then, but we don't think that's constructive, and then move on from there. So after that, you need to think about what do I need to think about.
And I think we've already started talking about these things with the previous slide. Part of this is about getting that conversation going, but at the same time making sure that you're also got at the back of your mind kind of the issues that you're going to need to kind of address that are your own creation, the issues that you're going to need to kind of identify that in the other party's creation, and also just make sure that as part of what you do, you don't send the wrong messages or suggest the wrong kind of outcome. We have seen in the past suppliers actually almost become a little bit too subservient and kind of doing everything they can to resolve the problem, but without actually making it clear that this is actually a goodwill gesture from them in terms of trying to resolve this, just to get to the point of getting this back on track. But then later, when things, despite the best effort, that hasn't happened, that effort that they've put in has been kind of used as evidence that clearly they were the party that had to do this sort of stuff. Otherwise, why would they have stepped up? So part of it is about trying to make sure that you do the things that you need to do to get this to a success point, but at the same time being clear about why that is happening.
Yeah, absolutely. So once you've considered what the issues are, kind of how you've contributed to those issues and what the issues are around that, you need to understand from that perspective. You then need to consider what the commercial realities are. So if that involves you thinking, well, I'm just going to throw the supplier in the bin and get a new one because they've given me kind of a change request, which is $1 million. You think that's outrageous, but then without thinking too hard about it, kind of pick up another third party supplier who will cost you $1.5 million to effectively finish and implement this project, consider and go, well. So it's very important to think about cost benefit. And also, as Simon mentioned earlier, these are inevitably a long partnership. It's not just implementation, because ultimately what you have is ongoing support usually as part of these projects as well.
Yeah. So it's and in the first session that we talked about wherever possible, kind of thinking about your plan B. So as you start to implement something, thinking about, well, what happens if this doesn't work? What is my plan B? How do I unpick this? Where do I go to next? Hopefully you have that option of, if all goes wrong, that there is this plan B for the customer. But reality is that sometimes that's just not the option. You've invested so long down this path that actually you can't throw them out now, because you've actually got 4 months left before this thing needs to go live. So that might be the answer. You can't. You've actually implemented a whole bunch of other software in the expectation that this is going to be delivered. All these reasons may actually impede. So it's actually about taking that step back now and assessing on the basis of what you originally intended, but actually where you are now. Also, I mean, it sounds very easy. A number of times we have these conversations about let's just terminate and we'll sort of, that's not always the best answer. In fact,
hardly ever the best answer. Not wanting to do myself out of work here, but you've got to really think about kind of the impact of that course of action on you and your business. Kind of it costs a lot of money, it takes a long time, and they're hard, frankly. You look at them internally, kind of you'll understand generally what's happened, but then you'll have to talk to somebody like us, bring us up to speed. Kind of if it's going to go to a mediation, we need to bring the mediator up to speed. If it's going to go down a litigation route, you're going to need to bring a judge up to speed. And kind of a lot of these people aren't necessarily kind of going to understand that underlying tech sort of focus. So it'll take a long time, and it'll be a massive distraction for you and your team. And this is the project team, and probably also depending on the size of the business, also kind of the kind of the executive team as well.
Yeah, and look, it's exactly the same on the supplier side. They're going to have to pull people out that they are, wanting to make money off, who are doing consulting somewhere else, to actually spend some time making sure that the case that is put forward is the right case, the strong case, and an accurate case. And so these people are no longer actually doing billable work or chargeable or recoverable work. They're actually now focused on something that's just going to consume a fair amount of their time. That's
Exactly.
assuming you can actually find them in the first place.
That's true. And look, I mean, I'm not saying that that's the wrong answer. It's just it is certainly something you need to think about when you are deciding which course of action you are going to take. So the last thing is, and this is partly what we've been talking about on the way through, is kind of now you've kind of got to this point. Does success look different now? Are you able to achieve the outcomes you need through a slightly different way of it? Yeah. So part of that is understanding what you want. What do you want? What do you actually need? And how is that going to give you a successful outcome for implementation? Then, given those circumstances, you need to clearly communicate what it is you need, what it is you want, and how you want to decide to kind of come to the party on that. But it can't all be a one-way street. You really do need to listen to the other side. They will have a very different countervailing view, and ultimately, those discussions are very helpful to understand what has gone wrong. Because if communication hasn't happened well up to that point, this should be a reset button. You should be talking very proactively and very openly with the other side.
Yeah, look, and I've seen a circumstance where a customer had all of the rights that they needed for liquidated damages and everything. The supplier actually said, look, sorry, it is a mistake that we've made, but it's a mistake that's actually at the core of our solution. So yes, you can kind of pursue us for your liquidated damages, but the reality is that we've got the same problem in a lot of different countries. And unfortunately, your liquidated damages are much smaller than the ones we're facing elsewhere. So we're going to have to commit our resource elsewhere. So, they could, and the liquidated damages weren't really the answer to the customer. So it's then at that point about not giving up your rights in relation to it. It's about, okay, let's park that to one side, make sure we don't compromise that, but what can we achieve? What can we achieve given that you're trying to solve this problem in the US and the UK and Japan at the same time? What can we achieve? And then trying to get to that point of kind of cauterizing the wound for yourself first, making sure that that things aren't as bad as they could be, and then going back and saying, okay, right, we've got back to a kind of a position that we can live with. Now, what else should we be doing?
Absolutely. And through this process, it's very easy to just kind of go away and sulk in a corner, but that's not going to help. You need to positively engage, and you also need to, we said you need to keep your hands clean. You need to continue to proactively kind of try and progress this project until the decision is made not to, basically. And so that's why we've then got a termination question mark, because that may ultimately be the answer. You terminate the agreement with the customer or the supplier, depending on which side of the fence you're on. But either way, you need to, particularly to the customer, you need to understand what is my plan B, what is my other plan B, and how do I get the result I need. And it's those things that you then need to kind of think about before you negotiate a resolution. So with the last bullet point we've got there is preserving your dispute assets. That is ensuring that you have access to your documents, all those sorts of things. Because, like I say, if you're a supplier, a number of these projects will be delivered in the kind of the main communication tool like Jira or Slack or something like that, which you will no longer have control over after the project ends, and effectively the customer just discontinues their access. So you need to think about that. You also need to think about your people. As we said, these tech disputes are inevitably hard, and they will inevitably take a wee while to get to court if that's ultimately where you get to. And so if your people may leave in the interim, and if that's the case, be nice to them. Make sure they're not a disaffected leaver, because that is going to be unhelpful for you in the long run.
Yeah, look, and I also look at, preserve your dispute assets as part of what I was talking about before, which is as you're trying to get through this to the point of cauterizing the wound, getting this back to a point of where you can actually still coexist and achieve at least some of the outcome. Just make sure that in the process of doing that, you don't end up compromising an argument that you might want to be running in relation to why you shouldn't be accountable for that damage, or why you should be able to recover that loss, or whatever it is. So, I see those also as dispute assets. And that is that really fine line that you have to walk between looking like you're just, setting the other side up for a large claim, but at the same time knowing that you need to get this solution implemented in some way so that your business can continue to operate, and it's getting that balance right.
Yeah, and there will be a natural tipping point, I think, at some stage when you start then setting yourself up for a claim, but when you've kind of almost basically given up on that after hopefully having a decent crack and kind of go through. Right, so the last thing is winning, really winning. You can go to court, you can win, and you can still lose. I mean, is the short answer, because you may end up with a solution that's not, kind of not helpful for your business. You may end up spending a lot of time and effort and kind of cost getting to somewhere that you didn't really want to be. So look, my advice is, again, just be really objective and try and view this as objectively and dispassionately as you can. A lot of litigation is sort of driven by subjective anger. And you might be quite peeved at the other side because you think they have done an absolutely terrible job, or they've kind of sold up the river. That sort of emotion, while valid, is not helpful in this sense. And so you need to think about that, and you need to ensure that everybody is taking an objective view of what is this going to cost us, and that is resource plus actual kind of financial cost.
Yeah, look, and then the final thing is, New Zealand's a really small market. Actually, not just New Zealand, but the tech sector is quite a small market itself. And reputations grow. And if you're a customer, if you become known as a difficult customer, a demanding customer, a customer that doesn't do what they need to do, the price of projects for you will be reflected. There will be a risk component that is probably added to your to any project that's done with you. On the other side, if you are a supplier and you're known for being unhelpful when these sort of things come on, you may find it harder to win projects. And I know that a number of customers have, as part of due diligence, kind of asked specific questions around what happened when something didn't quite go as planned. How did they behave? And that's really important to kind of be aware of as part of the process of getting to the end of a project that perhaps, or an issue that arises that you hadn't counted on is, did you roll up your sleeves? Did you solve things? Because that's going to make it easier the next time you're looking to make a sale.
Exactly, and look, on sort of that thing as well, this is, as Simon mentioned earlier, this is inevitably going to be well, not inevitably, but most likely going to be an ongoing relationship. Kind of winning on one particular issue may come back to bite you later on. And that's, kind of effectively, kind of you argue this is going to be a long-term project with long-term support requirements. And sort of like say, if you kind of get some early wins and the other side becomes aggrieved, it's going to be a pretty disaffected marriage.
Yeah. Having said that, look, if the project goes wrong, you're completely in the right. You've done nothing wrong. The other side is completely responsible for it all. You don't need to rely on them in the future, and the unavailability of their solution is not a problem to you. Have a go.
Go for gold.
But you just the chances of that being the case are pretty skinny. And so as a result, that's what you have to go through. You have to go through that process of assessing what's my culpability, what's the risk for me in relation to the fact that if this project doesn't get delivered, what's the et cetera, what's the cost, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And all of those things, at the end of it, you may still say, look, on the balance of it, I still want to have a crack at them. And and so be it. But it's about going through that process, making that informed decision. And that's the really important part of this.
Absolutely. Right. I think we're talking enough about
I think so.
So I guess, look, if we've got any questions, I'm not sure if we do or not, then happy to field them.
looks like we've got no questions. We obviously, as with all of the others, this video is going to be made available. The slides will be made available, so you can kind of have another look at it if you really want to, or if you haven't. If you want to look at the slides, by all means, if you've got any questions, we're always welcome. Oh, we have a question, but we're always welcome anybody giving us a call.
Absolutely.
We have one question. No?
Fabulous. Excellent. Well, look, it's been a pleasure talking to you.
Yeah.
We'll, like I say, feel free to get in touch if you do have any questions that you think of later on. Otherwise, good luck. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Cheers. Thanks a lot.